Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar. This month we're revisiting the use of zero-hours contracts. We hope you find it a useful and informative session and that you pick up a few practical tips or things to think about. My name is Alison Blackhurst. I'm the HR Knowledge Manager at HR Solutions and I will be leading today's session. I'm joined today by my colleague Sue Watson, who's our HR Operations Manager, and she will be here to field any technical problems. Hopefully we won't have any, and she will also be monitoring questions. Do send her a message if you anticipate any problems or you encounter any problems as we go through. Last time we did have a little bit of an issue with a delay in slides appearing, and I think we've come to the conclusion that that depends very much on people's internet connections where they are, because things were running smoothly at our end. If you do encounter any technical problems that we're unable to resolve today, then we are recording this session and we will be putting the recording onto our portal, and we can also send you a link to the YouTube recording, so you won't miss out altogether. So please do send Sue a message. I will be dealing with any questions at the end, dependent on time, and you can send Sue a message by typing into the little chat box at the bottom of your screen. I noticed it's very easy to do it because I sent a little message to everybody saying, could you hear my heavy breathing? I've been suffering from a cold and I thought I was breathing rather heavily, so it is very easy to send a message to all and sundry. So any questions to Sue and we will answer those. So today's topics. What is a zero-hours contract? Well, the use of zero-hours contracts by some of our well-known household names has attracted a lot of controversy recently and negative publicity for some as well. The unions, including particularly Unison, Unite and the TUC, have all raised concerns that these sort of contracts exploit vulnerable workers by making no promises of permanent or regular work. However, it's not all bad news. The CIP did some research, the CIPD Labour Market Outlook Survey, and that showed that zero-hours workers are more likely to be satisfied with their work-life balance. 65% of them were satisfied, compared to all employees generally, of whom only 58% were satisfied with their work-life balance. And also, workers on zero-hours contracts are less likely to feel under excessive pressure every day, compared to all employees, and also to have comparable job satisfaction. 60% of them were satisfied with their jobs compared to 59% of all employees. But the ONS has recently reported a significant increase in the number of workers on zero-hours contracts compared to last year, so clearly they are still popular with employees. So this webinar is about revisiting the use of zero-hours contracts. It's not necessarily about stopping the use of zero-hours contracts. What we thought we would do is to take a closer look again at these type of contracts to see why they work best and the pros and cons of using them, and also what alternative solutions there are. So just to start off with a few background facts. First of all, how many workers are on zero-hours contracts? Well, these contracts have been around for a long time. They're nothing new, particularly in the retail, hospitality and the healthcare sectors. But the use has extended over the past few years into social care, education, even to government departments and local councils. And it's no longer just low-skilled workers who are on zero-hours contracts, but also things like university lecturers. The recent ONS figures, this is the 2016 Labour Force Survey, which covered April to July this year, found that we had over 900,000 workers in the UK, that's 2.9% of our working population, on zero-hours contracts in their main job. And that's an increase of 21% over the year. Now, this increase may be in part due to higher awareness of the term, because everybody's been reading about zero-hours contracts because of the negative press coverage. But a lot of these workers had been with the same employer for more than a year, and 900,000 workers is a lot of our workforce. Now, zero-hours contracts are more common in larger businesses. 40% of businesses with more than 250 workers make some use of them, compared with around 10% of businesses with fewer than 10 workers. And they're also more prevalent in particular industries. 26% of businesses, for example, in the accommodation and food industry, employ some staff on a zero-hours basis. And they're used by many of our best known employers. We'll be talking later about Wetherspoons and McDonald's, but also Burger King, Domino's Pizzas. All of these sort of employers are using 0 hours contracts. Public opinion is divided on their use. Some people are condemning them altogether, but not all employees feel unjustly treated, and many employers use the contracts legally, and I think that is an important point to make. These are not illegal contracts, provided that they are operated properly. So how many do you have in your business? Well, let's have a look at the legal considerations before we go any further and look at what we mean by a 0 hours contract, and then the entitlements that apply to these workers. For the first time ever, we got a definition of a 0 hours contract in the Small Business Enterprise and Employment Act 2015. So the definition hasn't been around for a very long time, even though the actual concept of 0 hours contracts has been. And the Small Business Enterprise and Employment Act defines a 0 hours contract as a contract of employment or other workers' contract under which the undertaking to do or perform work or services is an undertaking to do so conditionally on the employer making work or services available to the worker. And B, there is no certainty that any such work or services will be made available to the worker. So it's a contract, but it's a contract that has no guaranteed work and therefore no guaranteed pay. So the worker may be required to remain on call and to be available for work during stipulated periods, but is actually only paid for any hours that they actually work. So what happens in practice with these sort of contracts is usually the worker will be contacted at the beginning of each week and told when he or she is required to work. Although some employers are also required, some workers are also required to remain available on call throughout the working week just in case they're needed, so that if somebody rings in sick or goes home ill or anything like that, then they will receive a phone call saying, can you please come in? Now the worker is not entitled to be paid for any time spent on call unless he or she is required to be present at the workplace. And that can be one of the disadvantages of these sort of contracts, because it's not much fun if you're sitting there with a contract that says we will give you work, but you have got to be available for it, and please just sit by the phone and wait for us to call, if in reality you get very few calls and you don't know when they're going to be, because it also prevents you from working elsewhere. Now 0 hours contracts are not the same as a casual contract, okay? A casual worker is not obliged to accept work, nor the employer to offer work. So with a 0 hours contract, the employer doesn't necessarily have to offer work, but the employee is expected to do it when it is offered. With a casual worker, they are free to turn work down if they are unable or unwilling to do it on the particular day that it's offered. So casual workers are more like bank workers. That's another way they can be called, but they are free agents. They're employees usually at the time that they're working for you, but they are not employees when they're not working for you. So with casual contracts, usually there's a break in service between each assignment that they undertake for you. So they'll come and they'll do a week's work for you, they accept that, then their employment ceases. Then you ring them up again a couple of weeks later and say, could you come in and do a day's work? And they do. And at the end of that day, their employment ceases. With 0 hours workers, the employment continues, but the pay can fluctuate widely depending on the amount of work they do. So what rights do 0 hours workers have? Well, all workers on 0 hours contracts, and this is workers and employees, are still entitled to protection under the working time regulations. So that includes the accrual of statutory paid holiday. And that's where there was so much negative press coverage for Sports Direct because it hadn't been paying the statutory paid holiday to its workers. And these workers are also entitled to receive the national minimum wage for all of the hours that they actually work. So there may not be any guaranteed hours and therefore no guaranteed pay, but these employees still accrue other statutory rights, for example, the right to bring a claim of unfair dismissal, redundancy pay, 2P consultation, family leave and statutory sick pay, provided that they work sufficient hours or have the requisite length of service to become entitled to those statutory rights. So what is different about them? Well, Firstly, as from May 2015, clauses in the contract that are exclusivity clauses are banned. Now, an exclusivity clause is a provision in a contract which prevents the worker from performing other work or stops him from working elsewhere without the employee's consent. And those clauses are now unenforceable in a contract that guarantees no hours. So only those employers who are able to offer a guaranteed number of hours can prevent their workers from working elsewhere. If you think about it, it's very, very common in standard contracts of employment to say you will not undertake other work without our prior permission, for the simple reason that you don't want your employees working for competitors, and also you don't want them breaching the working time regulations by taking on other work in addition to yours, which takes them over the 48-hour limit. So those sort of clauses are very, very standard in standard employment contracts. You cannot have exclusivity clauses in a 0 hours contract. However, at the moment that law has no teeth. Those clauses are unenforceable, but there isn't any detriment for having them in the contract. And that's a change that we had been expecting. So there are changes that haven't yet materialised. We were waiting for the draft 0 hours workers exclusivity terms regulations 2015 to come into force, and these aim to deter employers from getting around the ban on exclusivity clauses, for example by offering a contract which has a very small number of guaranteed hours. Yeah? The regulations were also expected to extend the ban to cover contracts that don't guarantee the worker a specified minimum weekly income. And that was going to be calculated by multiplying a set number of hours, which was expected to be 35, by the adult national minimum wage rate. So effectively the living wage times 35. That threshold wouldn't apply to workers who are guaranteed an hourly rate of pay of at least £20 an hour. Now those changes have not yet come into force. We had been expecting them. We had also expected future regulations which would give 0 hours workers a new right not to suffer a detriment because the worker had done work or performed services under another contract or arrangement. Because workers who consider that they've suffered a detriment, such as being dismissed or not being offered any hours because they tried to work elsewhere, would be able to lodge a claim to the employment tribunal. At the moment what we have is a rule that says exclusivity clauses cannot be enforced, but if a worker goes and works elsewhere, there's very little they can do about it if the employer simply turns around and just offers them less work than they had been getting before. The new regulations would have actually given them more protection by allowing them to bring a tribunal claim in that case. And those regulations were expected this autumn. It could well be that Brexit referendum and the change of Prime Minister have delayed things slightly, but the government has now announced a wide-ranging independent review of employment practices, and this is expected to consider whether our current employment law adequately covers the increasing use of non-standard forms of employment, particularly with regard to 0 hours workers and temporary workers and the greater use of self-employment within the gig economy. Now this review is expected to focus particularly on job security, pay and workers' rights, and it's expected to take about 6 months. So it might well be that sometime further down the track we end up with some further restrictions. Or we could even follow countries such as New Zealand. Now New Zealand, as from the 1st of April this year, has banned the use of 0 hours contracts altogether. Employers in New Zealand must now guarantee a minimum number of hours work each week, and workers can refuse to work any extra hours without repercussions. Are we likely to see a ban altogether? Well, I think there'd be an awful lot of opposition about that. The Institute of Directors is very clear that it does not want this form of contract banned because it thinks that it could punish workers who genuinely do prefer the flexibility they offer, and it could also push us into the same position as our EU neighbours, Italy and Spain, that don't have a flexible labour market. So there will be an awful lot of an outcry if it seems that 0 hours contracts are going to be banned. And the thing to remember at the end of the day is if these contracts are used correctly, they can benefit both the employer and the employee. Basically because the employees can balance work against other commitments, and because the employers are not obliged to offer work, the employer has savings in costs as well because it limits their overhead liabilities. Now, just one final point on legal considerations is to be aware of discrimination with the use of 0 hours contracts. If you use these contracts, you do run the risk of sex and age discrimination claims for the simple reason that many 0 hours workers are women, students in full-time education or working part-time, or also those aged under 25 or 65 and over. And if you find that you are putting workers of particular groups at a disadvantage because you're paying them worse terms and conditions than your other workers, you could end up with a claim against you. And there is also the potential of claims under the part-time workers regulations. If you remember, the part-time workers regulations defines part-time work as anything that's less than full-time work. So a 0 hours worker clearly works less hours than a full-time worker, so they could bring a claim under the part-time workers regulations if you treat them differently from your full-time workers on a pro rata basis. So why would we use these contracts? If there's such negative publicity about them, why are they a good thing? Why do we still want to have them? Well, for employers, first of all, employers say that these contracts allow them to align the fluctuating demands for their services with the cost of delivering it. So, for example, I said earlier that they're very prevalent in the food and accommodation industry. If you take a hotel based in a holiday area, it's likely to need extra staff during the summer months and it's likely to need fewer during the winter. On the other hand, a hotel in a city centre or a country park might need fluctuating numbers of staff at short notice to accommodate conferences or large parties or wedding receptions. So they're very good at helping employers to deal with fluctuating demands. They can also be very useful where the workforce is fluctuating, i.e. a workforce where there is high turnover, high sickness rates, or for things like holiday cover or other absences. And they work particularly well where the roles are low-skilled roles, where there is a ready supply of available workers who can be trained quickly and cheaply to step in straight away. There are lower liabilities for the employer. For example, if there is a fall in demand, then you're not looking at statutory redundancy payments. And there also is a lower emotional liability and effect on morale. Many employers have gone through redundancies over the last few years. They now have a reduced workforce with little slack in it, but they've experienced the emotional cost of making people redundant and the effect that that has had on the rest of their workforce. And these people might have turned to 0 hours contracts as a way of keeping the headcount down, but also as a way of being able to reassure the remaining employees that their jobs are more secure. And finally, agency workers, who are obviously an alternative in the sense of helping you out, to cope with unexpected peaks and troughs in work, the higher fees as a result of the agency workers regulations may well have also encouraged an interest in 0 hours contracts, because once you've had, not only do you have to pay agency fees if you have agency workers, but also after 12 weeks placement you have to match the same rate of pay and terms and conditions as applies to your other employees. So agency workers can be quite an expensive way of dealing with short-term demands. On the downside, workers on 0 hours contracts may well lack motivation and loyalty. It's likely that there will be a high turnover of staff due to the nature of contracts, and the workers need to find more stable employment, i.e. more stable pay in reality. Therefore, you can end up spending a lot of time and money on recruitment, on training, on monitoring and administration for these workers. If we look at employees, what's in it for employees? Well, some, not all, but some workers may well find that the flexibility of the 0 hours contracts better suits their lifestyle and other commitments. And this is not just carers, but also those with all sorts of other commitments. And as I said earlier, the CIPD survey found that 0 hours workers were more likely to be happy with their work-life balance than other workers. However, the CIPD's research did highlight areas of concern, and usually it's money and also the lack of notice of the work that they're going to be doing. There's nothing more irritating, they say, than finding out at the beginning of an expected shift that the work has been cancelled. Those who are required to remain on call or standby for specific periods of time when they're not paid may suffer, especially if there's very little likelihood of them being required, or alternatively if they're given little notice of any requirement to work, such as being called in immediately to cover sickness or breaks or an unexpected influx of customers. In these circumstances, the workers are unable to claim benefits because they can't sign on, because they can't say that they're available for work. It's hard for them to predict their earnings if these fluctuate widely, and because there's an imbalance of power in the working relationship, often they feel that they have to accept all work offered. So the lack of financial stability may mean that it's unlikely that a person on a 0 hours contract would be able to get a mortgage or a loan unless the hours had been reasonably stable for a period of time. Furthermore, whilst they're working alongside permanent employees, they may never gain the same benefits such as contractual holiday or sick pay or enhanced redundancy pay or family leave. This may be seen as unfair, but as I said before, it also may be directly or indirectly discriminatory. So pros and cons to these contracts. So what is changing? Well, I think largely because of the media coverage, many employers are now reconsidering their extensive use of 0 hours contracts, and they're offering their regular workers a choice of remaining as they are or of taking a contract with a guaranteed minimum number of hours. We have to mention Sports Direct. We can't miss them given the amount of coverage that they've had. And they allegedly had over 20,000 workers on 0 hours contracts, none of whom allegedly received paid holiday, sick pay, or the bonuses that were awarded to full-time staff. So the directors of Sports Direct must be regretting the day they decided on the widespread use of these contracts. Now, Sports Direct has now announced that it will give its 18,000 directly employed retail staff on 0 hours contracts a choice. Either they can switch to an arrangement which guarantees them at least 12 hours per week if they prefer this, or they can stay as they are. Green King, whose chains include the Wacky Warehouse and Chef and Brewer, they've now offered thousands of pub workers minimum hours. Wetherspoons has offered 24,000 staff the choice between a 0 hours contract and one which offers fixed hours, and it reported that around 2/3 of the staff chose to move on to contracts which guaranteed them around about 70% of the hours that they normally worked each week. Now, McDonald's, interestingly, had a different experience. They ran a pilot scheme, and they offered their workers a choice of either 4, 16 or 30-hour contracts. And interestingly, over 80% of the employees in the pilot opted to stay on their existing flexible contract. So clearly they were quite happy with the 0 hours arrangements, and they were probably even happier because they'd actually been offered a choice and had opted to stay on those. So a bit of the Hawthorne effect with that one. And I think at the end of the day, it probably is horses for courses. There will be some people who are very happy with the 0 hours arrangement, and there will be others whose need for guaranteed work or guaranteed income means that they will never be happy with the 0 hours arrangement because primarily they are looking for security and regularity of work. So what are the alternatives? Well, let's take a look at some of the alternatives that are available. I mean, we could look at part-time contracts, part-time flexible contracts. And what we mean by this is a part-time contract which guarantees a certain number of hours with the possibility of overtime, which will be at basic rate when the need arises. Now, this may be a better solution if what you actually need is for your workers to work regular core hours with the odd increased requirement, because it's providing that worker with more security and also a greater sense of belonging to your organisation, so it's likely to give you a little more loyalty as well. Now, with this sort of contract, you either could have guaranteed hours which are static, i.e. we would like you to work 3 days a week between these particular hours, or you could actually have a contract that says we'd like you to work these hours flexibly over a stipulated period, i.e. 10 hours per week to be worked at agreed times between 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. on Mondays to Fridays, something like that. That way, what you are actually doing is giving the employees some guarantee of work and pay, and not requiring them to stay at home on a 24/7 basis in the hope of a phone call, but you are actually still able to change the hours that they are working within the parameters that you've set. Now, apparently the average number of hours usually worked by somebody on a 0 hours contract is 25 hours a week. That's the ONS figure. So it would seem that an awful lot of 0 hours workers are actually working more regularly and routinely than would be expected of a totally casual workforce. Now note, if you go along the part-time route, that part-time workers, i.e. anybody who's contracted for fewer hours than would normally be regarded as full-time for that employment, have the same employment rights as their full-time colleagues, and their pay and benefits must be prorated to the full-time equivalent. The advantages of this may include the ability of the workers to work more hours when needed, and the ability to recruit and retain skilled staff who don't want to work full-time for whatever reason. And multi-skilling these employers may also give you a more flexible workforce who can cover for each other and for sickness and holidays and etc. Disadvantages of part-time contracts can be problems with meeting ongoing requirements if the employee is only available to deal with that particular work on certain days, and there can be issues where full-time employees don't receive it overtime, irrespective of how many extra hours they put in, but their part-time colleagues do. But part-time employment is a much more traditional form of contract and generally easy to manage. Annualised hours contracts can be a little trickier. Now this is another alternative, but an annualised hours contract is where the employer offers a guaranteed number of hours every year, and the employee is obliged to work these hours, but the workload is spread unequally over the year. So the worker ends up working more hours at peak times and little or no work is offered at other times, but they actually receive the payment for the guaranteed hours spread evenly on either a monthly or weekly basis. So they have their guaranteed pay, which gives them that security, but they work according to the demands of the job. So annual hours contracts work best where the workload has significant peaks and troughs over the year, and especially when the troughs can be seen and the peaks can be foreseen. So, for example, people know that in December they're going to be working twice as hard as in August, for example. While the employee's working hours are expressed as an annual total and fluctuate according to demand, contractually the pay is averaged out over the year. So the employee gets a regular payment in equal instalments. And the business also avoids overtime premiums and downtime by scheduling the working hours as and when they're needed. Now, very often with these sort of contracts you have a number of core hours which you work each week or month, and then the remaining hours, the flexi hours, are used during busier periods. So it's not usually a case of all or nothing. There are some regular hours which are set in advance, and then floating hours which are used as and when needed. They do work well for seasonal fluctuations. They also work well when you have major deadlines for projects which create differing workloads. And you can also use annual hours contracts for term time only working arrangements. Now, introducing this sort of contract is quite complex, and it does need to be very closely tailored to the business, taking into account the production processes or the services provided. So employee consultation is absolutely essential where you already have more traditional contracts in place. Workers on annualised hours contracts, well, normal employment legislation still applies. So they would still have to be paid the national minimum wage for each pay period and to work in accordance with the working time regulations, and so you might well need opt-outs or workforce collective agreements with longer reference periods. The disadvantages of annualised hours contracts, well, once the work moves from being a flexible arrangement to more regular patterns and the worker gets used to the regular patterns, when flexibility is suddenly required again, it often doesn't go down very well. They don't like it, they've got used to the regularity, and they don't like it when they're called out. Also, it's usual with these sort of contracts to write off any unused hours at the end of each year. If this happens often, the employees get used to this again, and they can be reluctant to then actually work their full contracted hours if and when things change. But they can be very useful in certain circumstances. Casual agreements. Now, these may also be a possibility to meet ad hoc requirements where there really is no regularity or pattern of work. Casual workers are those who are ad hoc. They are only used on an occasional basis, and they may, like agency workers, provide cover at short notice or during busy periods. And building up a bank of casual workers can be very, very sensible because it's people that you know and you've trained and you can call on. Although they're protected by employment legislation in many areas, there are limitations, because employment protection which is linked to continuous periods of service will not normally apply to casual workers, because during each assignment when they're not working, the continuity of employment is broken. So with casual workers, really it's a case of taking a lot of care to ensure that these workers are truly ad hoc, that casual workers sign an agreement that say that each period of work is regarded as separate, and when there's no work it's not a temporary cessation, it's an actual cessation of work. Yeah? And also that these workers do turn work down, because the key point with casual workers is that there shouldn't be any, it's called mutuality of obligation. Now, mutuality of obligation is where the worker is obliged to accept any work offered and the employer is obliged to offer it. If the worker is free to decide whether to accept each engagement offered and the employer is not obliged to offer any work, then there's no mutuality of obligation. So with casual workers, it's often quite a sensible idea to actually offer them work which you know that they're not going to actually accept, so that actually there is documentary evidence of the fact that work has been turned down. Now, do note that issues can arise with casual contracts when individuals who are given regular work challenge their worker status and seek to say that they're employees. So do ensure that they have an agreement that specifies the nature of the relationship. Try to ensure that when you offer in them work you don't follow any particular pattern or degree of regularity, that you offer work which they decline and you keep a record of all their refusals, and also that they know that there's no mutuality of obligation between assignments. A lot of these sort of things is a case of managing expectations and not changing the terms halfway through. Now, if all of those sound too difficult, then do bear in mind that you can actually build some flexibility into standard contracts. Now, this could include either having layoff clauses or short-time working clauses in your standard contracts. These enable an employer to reduce the work and pay to meet an unexpected downturn, or if it works the other way and you know that a particular month is your nightmare time, then there is nothing to stop you building in a requirement to work a certain amount of overtime in that period. For example, an accountancy firm with a tax department where they know that January is going to be an absolutely manic month, building in a requirement that everybody does at least 6 hours overtime each week during January. And if that's in the contract, then you know that you've got that time built in. That could then be given as time off in lieu later on, or it could be paid at basic rate or an enhanced rate, whatever you decide the contractual terms will be. Other variations are fixed-term or temporary contracts where the peak is for a few weeks or for a particular project. Using agency staff if you only need them for less than 12 weeks and you don't want to spend the time and money recruiting. Or actually a mix of all of these, because it is possible that some of the above may work better than having a total reliance on 0 hours and could end up with a happier workforce and an improved reputation given the current perceptions and misperceptions about 0 hours contracts. So where would you start with all of this? It's always easier to give you the theory than, than the things to do in practice, of course. Well, the first step is to look at your workforce and your business needs. Identify which areas of your business use 0 hours contracts at the moment, to what extent and why. What are the typical hours worked by those on 0 hours contracts? Is there a regular pattern to it? And what is the makeup of the workforce on 0 hours contracts? Is it students? Is it women? Is it young employees, etc.? Is there a potential discrimination angle if these sort of contracts are offered only to certain groups? Look at the periods when you've needed extra staff. Look at patterns of overtime. Look at periods of layoff. Consider whether you can develop ways of evening out those peaks and troughs. If you can't, then are the peaks predictable? When do they occur? Is there a way of knowing how you're going to meet those peaks? Now, if the peaks are production-led, then is there a good way of moving the workload to quieter periods? Would having a time off in lieu system mean that trained staff work additional hours when needed, but instead of resulting in the additional expense of overtime, take time off at a later, quieter date to compensate? If demand fluctuates between departments or roles, would it be sensible to have more flexible staff who can move between the departments and roles? Might that be a better solution? Can you encourage your customers and clients to use your services or to order products at a quieter time in the year by giving them special promotions or early order discounts or reduced rates for repeat bookings, etc.? Is there any way that you can encourage them to give you more warning of their requirements? If holiday covers the problem, can you encourage staff to spread their holidays over the year, i.e. take 1 week in each quarter, or during your quieter periods, either by refusing requests at certain times or by moving your holiday year so that the remaining holidays used up during less busy times? I mean, what we're trying to encourage you to think about here is better ways of actually using your existing staff rather than a reliance on 0 hours contracts. If absence is the key trigger for needing short-time replacements, other ways of improving your absence management and reducing the amount of frequent short-term absences. So look at your requirements against your current staffing levels. Then have a look at your recruitment and retention. Is it hard to find suitable employees? Do you invest in training and development for these workers? And if so, what's the cost of this? What is your turnover and how does this compare to similar organisations? And the key question has to be, are you losing good workers who are on 0 hours contracts because they are leaving you to go and work for employers who will offer them more stability or better benefits? Have a look at your clients and customers. If you have high turnover, does this affect your ability to deliver consistent, high-level services to your clients and customers? Are ongoing relationships with these people necessary to good customer service? All of these are things that may well sway your thinking when you're looking at your reliance on 0 hours contracts. And finally, the workers themselves. Do you really know if they're happy with the current arrangements? A lot of people have been reluctant to say that they're unhappy because they don't want to upset their employers and they want to ensure that they are able to take advantage of any work that is offered. So you might want to consider running an anonymous survey or some focus groups to find out how your 0 hours workers really feel about the contracts and what arrangements they might prefer if practical. At the end of the day, even if the majority vote to remain as they are, the option of a choice may make some feel much happier. If you plan to retain the use of 0 hours contracts, then do ensure that you're retaining them, that you're treating them fairly, and that they enjoy similar terms and benefits on a pro rata basis to your other employees. Now, in terms of pay, all workers are entitled to receive at least the national minimum wage for all hours worked. The TUC has done some analysis and it has found that typical UK employees earn £11.05 an hour, whereas the median hourly rate for a 0 hours worker is only £7.25. So this seems to be an area to consider carefully if you want to have the same level of commitment and morale and retention as you find amongst your other workers, and especially if they work together. Holiday arrangements. Now, how are you going to administer this? 0 hours workers are still entitled to 5.6 weeks holiday every year under the working time regulations. So deciding and checking and paying holiday using the average of the previous 12 weeks pay to calculate average pay can be an administrative headache. What you may want to do is to encourage them to take holiday in whole weeks, especially if you actually close on all of the bank holidays, so that's 8 days a year, and you would pay them for those days, and then have 4 weeks to take at a different time. Because calculating holiday, if your employees are allowed to take holiday in hours or days or half days, you're going to have to recalculate their pay every time they take holiday because their hours fluctuate and therefore their pay fluctuates. Pensions is an area to be aware of because auto-enrollment obligations will apply to 0 hours workers once they meet the earnings requirements. So you need a system that continually checks their average earnings and flags up when an employee meets the trigger points. And continuous service, subject to clocking up the appropriate length of service, as 0 hours workers will still have employment rights such as the right not to be unfairly dismissed or the right to a statutory redundancy payment. Now, I come from Yorkshire, where the saying is twice an out's an out, and it is. Employers might assume because the guaranteed pay is 0, any award based on this contract will be 0, but actually it won't. You're looking at average earnings, and as many of these employees work quite a large number of hours on a regular basis, this type of contract will often not reduce the cost of a claim against an unwary employer. And do note as well that the same disciplinary procedure will apply to an employee on 0 hours who's underperforming as would apply to a full-time equivalent. We need to avoid the risk of falling foul of the part-time workers regulations or running the risk of a potential discrimination claim. So it is a case of looking also at how, not only what are you paying and what benefits are you giving, but also how work is offered to avoid discrimination between the workers themselves. It's so tempting to keep going back to the same more reliable employees each time and the ones that everybody gets on well with, and also to offer these particular people any vacancies that arise. But you do need to monitor how and when you offer work to 0 hours employees. Many of them will have childcare and other caring responsibilities, yeah, and also to consider what action you will take if employees refuse to be available at certain times. What we can't do here is to just offer the graveyard shifts to those who are most desperate for work and the more lucrative shifts to particular groups of employers. You have to be even-handed in the way that the work is offered. Finally, consider how to balance your business needs, having now analysed all of these, with the needs of your workers. And, do you know, it may well be that you find that what you have works just fine. Or you might discover that some of your employees weren't as content as you imagined, or that you're spending lots of money on overtime and then you have employees sitting around with nothing to do at other times. What your review may well throw up is that actually a mix of standard full-time and part-time contracts supplemented by 0 hours where necessary and or casual agreements could be the best way in balancing your needs for flexibility within the organisation with the needs of your workers. Now, we do offer further guidance on a lot of this, needless to say. If you want to have a look at our portal, we have guides to 0 hours contracts, to employment status and employee rights, and we also have template contracts. If anybody wants to look at the labour force survey that I was referring to earlier, the link is there, and as I said, that will be on our portal later on as well. So, does anybody have any questions? Oh, that's great. Thank you for putting me on the spot. We have a question here. What is your opinion on the recent Uber case? Well, it's an interesting one, this one, actually. I did read through the tribunal judgment, which was 40 pages of incredibly well-reasoned arguments, actually, and some scathing comments as well. And basically, I think at the end of the day, we were looking at workers in reality. The people that sign up for, I mean, first of all, Uber argued that all of the workers that they had were truly self-employed individuals growing their own businesses. But in fact, the workers do not contract with their passengers. The people who actually have the rides have a contract with Uber, who sets the rate of pay. The workers themselves basically accept work by signing on to an app, and Uber offers them the rides and negotiates the rate of pay with the passengers and then determines the route that those drivers take. So what the tribunal said is, when the app is turned on, these people are workers. They're not free to do what they like. They're not building up contacts and business contacts with people that they are contracting with. They don't negotiate the rates with them. They follow the routes that Uber sets, yes, and actually Uber takes the risk rather than the employee if things go wrong with the fares. So generally speaking, they are under Uber's control while they're actually signed on to the app. So they are workers. They're, i.e. this group of grey individuals in the middle who are not self-employed and not employees. Workers are entitled to holiday pay, and they're also entitled to the minimum wage, and they're also entitled to take breaks in accordance with the working time regulations. I think that was the right outcome. We understand that it is going to be appealed, and we also understand that there are an awful lot of other companies watching that case very, very carefully. Apparently Deliveroo is one in particular, and Hermes has also had action taken. So I'm sure there are an awful lot of companies in the gig economy that are actually watching the Uber case very, very carefully and saying, oh gosh, is this going to apply to us? And I think it's one of the things that the government is looking at in the review that we talked about earlier. Any other questions? Someone said here, are individuals on 0 hours contracts protected by 2P? And are they eligible for any subsequent redundancy payment that may be appropriate? Well, if they are employees with no guaranteed hours, then yes, they would be eligible to be protected by 2P and any subsequent redundancy payment that may be appropriate. If, however, they were casual workers who accept ad hoc assignments, and where the continuity of employment is broken between those assignments, then they would not. No more questions at the moment. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for your time. If you do think of any other questions, do by all means get in touch with us and we will reply to you individually. Thank you for your time. I hope you found the session useful and that you got some food for thought from it. Thank you. Bye-bye.